That's sort of fun. Yeah. Hey, hi everyone. It is great to be here and talking about one of my absolutely favorite things, which is pollination biology. I've been here at U of A for, I don't know, 30 something years. And I started out a tropical biologist and I've ended up very much a desert ecologist and am very devoted to our desert plants, but you know far more about them than I possibly do. Okay, now how do I change this? Is that not?
Should be the down arrow.
The down arrow. No. Am I holding this upside down? How is it? No. Oh,
You can just use that.
I can always use this. Or not. Okay. Maybe that'll work now sometime.
Yeah,
okay. Okay, well, this is basically what I want to do today, and it's so hard to pick topics. I don't know if any of you were involved, but I just finished a 10-hour series on pollination at the Humanities Seminars program. So I had to condense 10 hours worth of material down to like 45 minutes. So I made some choices. I'm hoping that in the last 15 minutes or so, let's just have an open discussion and ask me anything about pollination. I'll probably be able to tell you a good story. So this is basically what I want to do. I want to say a few words about plant reproduction in general, and then sort of talk about how you can look at a desert flower and have some sense of who the pollinator is. And then I want to introduce sort of three conceptually oriented issues that have to do with pollination. And I'm going to give you one example of each of them from our own work. And again, this was very hard to do. And finally, if I have time, I want to talk a little bit about the future of pollination in a changing world and what we can do. So let's start in with plant reproduction. So I was away all last year. I was in Berlin on sabbatical, and it was so green and so beautiful. And I came back in mid-July, and that's out my front door. And I'm just looking and thinking, oh God, it's bleak. It's so bleak here. But then, you know what happens, right? You start to see the flowers come out. Our smaller cacti, what a riot of color. Saguaros, I missed the saguaros this year, which was tragic, but so gorgeous. Our other kind of iconic Sonoran Desert flowers, this range of sizes and colors and shapes, and just, is so beautiful. You get up to higher elevations, you get, past our buffalo grass, and, you have our mistletoes and the prickly poppies and the columbines and the ipomopsis and so on, and just this riot of color and shapes. So you move, even higher. You have the yuccas, the datura. I'll talk about some of these. Agaves, manzanita. We've worked on basically all of these. And it's just the diversity is so mind-boggling. And it makes you wonder, like, what explains this incredible array of shapes and sizes and odors? So you have, the massive saguaro flower, and then in the same habitat, the mistletoe, which is the flowers like the size of a pinhead. Then you have two plants that the same hawk moths visit, agave and datura, but this one, the flowers smell like rotting fruit, and this one smells like jasmine, right? You look at our barrel cacti, and as you probably know, there's color variation from red to orange to yellow. What explains all of that? And, these are the kind of questions that I've been thinking about just for many years. What explains the diversity? Well, when you talk about flowers, you move immediately to pollination and reproduction, because that's what it's all about, right? You have Datura wrightii, one of the species I work on, Jimson weed, hawk moth pollinated. you end up from the hawk moths pollinating, you end up with a fruit and seeds. Each of those has a little food body on it that gets moved by ants. And the seeds germinate and give you plants. So, what it's all about is reproduction. The sperm has to move, the pollen has to move, and something has to move it. It's just that the diversity of ways in which it happens is just kind of mind-blowing, right? So, we can step way back and just sort of say, well, how do plants reproduce anyway? And it turns out there's a bunch of different ways, right? The first is just skip sexual reproduction entirely and clone yourself. And plenty of plants do that. It's generally a backup mechanism. There's very few plants that only clone themselves, but it's a backup. If you're in a grove of aspen, that's all one tree. It's all connected underground because that's the major way that they reproduce. They clone, they pop up new trees. They also produce flowers and make some seeds, but that's a lot of it. Chain fruit cholla, those are all asexually produced, and they fall to the ground and you get a new plant, but they also make flowers. So that's the first thing you can do, is just skip sex. The second thing is make a flower, but pollinate yourself. Okay, and that's pretty good assurance that you're going to make some seeds. Now, the problem, of course, is that you're mating with yourself with all the possible costs of inbreeding. And there's a lot of different ways that this can happen. There might be no pollen movement at all. So the flower stays closed and they just, the pollen fertilizes the ovules in the bud. That's one way. A pollinator could come pick up pollen and then put it right down on the same flower or another flower of the same plant. Or the parts of the flower can actually move a bit so that pollen is deposited on the flower. And this is what goes on in passion flower. If no pollinator comes at the end of the day, the anthers actually move and slap pollen on the stigma. And so it's like, but that only happens if they did not get pollen from another individual. Now, a lot of that is, again, a sort of a backup mechanism. If you didn't get pollen from another individual, at least you can pollinate yourself. Another way is you can get pollinated is to do it by non-biological means. And that really comes down to the wind or water. We don't have water pollination to speak of around here, although it's really cool. We do have a heck of a lot of wind pollination, right? All of our grasses and many other species, any plant with very few exceptions that is an allergen, a pollen allergen, is wind dispersed pollen, because it's produced in vast quantities, very tiny grains, and is blowing around in the air. So when you have pollen allergies, it's generally wind pollination. And then the last, of course, is the most spectacular and is what gives rise to the most spectacular flowers. And that is lure pollinators, lure animals to move pollen between flowers. So who does pollinate who? Well, you can look at a flower and make some pretty decent guesses. And I think you all likely know this, particularly since I'm sure you're all avid gardeners and you've gotten to know who comes to your different flowers. But it's worth thinking about this, and also just to get some pictures of local species up. Well, first of all, there's pollination by insects, and far and away, the most important and the best understood and the pollinators we're most concerned about is bees. And I do want to make this point, if many people haven't come and already told you this, Tucson is the world center of bee diversity. We have about 1,400 species of bees within a 40-mile radius of Tucson. We have far more bees than the Amazon rainforest, far more bees than anywhere on the planet. And researchers now are cataloging all that diversity. Now, what characterizes a bee-pollinated flower? Well, they're open during the day. There are a tiny handful of bees worldwide that can fly after dusk. So in general, it's a daytime system. The flowers are very brightly colored, often pink, yellow, blue, so a lot of variation. The flowers are either fairly flat, like this barrel cactus flower, like this cholla flower, or kind of tubular, like this manzanita flower. They are sweet smelling, and they have a fair amount of nectar in them, and it's a sucrose-based nectar. And there's been a lot of interest in the chemistry of nectar. It kind of corresponds to who the pollinator is. This, by the way, is Bombus sonoris. It's our only bumblebee species around here. It's really interesting. We have this crazy high diversity of bees, but we only have one bumblebee, which in other habitats are really common. Then we have night flying moths, which I work on, and so I'm very attached to. The white-lined sphinx moth, Hyles lineata, is probably the most common in North America and really common here as well. The Sonita moth, which is the only possible pollinator of Sonita cactus. And this generalization, oh, and this is Manduca sexta, the tobacco hornworm, and Datura, and I'm going to tell you about this. And there's some generalizations you could make about moth-pollinated flowers. For one thing, except for Hyles lineata, the white-lined sphinx moth, all our hawk moths fly at night. Okay, so the flowers are generally open at night. They're tubular. Some of them are very, very large. The hawk moths are large. They're white. They have a very jasmine odor to them, beautiful flowers, and they have a huge amount of nectar because these moths have very, very high energy needs. Okay, so all these things, if you have a flower like that, a white flower, particularly low to the ground, smells like jasmine, you know, Queen of the Night, for instance, you know it's hawk moth pollinated. Pollination by birds. Now, birds fly during the day, right? So once again, you see the bright colors. And often this very tubular shape, not surprising, it corresponds to the shape of the bill. Generalizations about hummingbird pollinated flowers, like our ocotillos. They're open by day, they're tubular shaped. Most of them are red, and there's actually been a lot of questions as to why they're red. It's not that birds see red better, interestingly. They have no odor because birds, they have a sense of smell, but they just don't use it to find flowers. And they have nectar. It's often hexose-based nectar. And then there's mammal pollination. And certainly around here, the only relevant mammals, and terribly important, are bats. In other parts of the world, there are some other mammals that pollinate. What can we say about bat pollination? Well, they're also open at night and white and tubular. And that way, they're kind of like the hawk moth pollinated flowers. The flowers tend to be very stout because bats tend to slam into them at a fairly high rate. They're white, they're very fruity smelling. They smell a bit like rotting fruit. Very robust, and they have huge amounts of nectar. And they're held kind of upright. Now, when it comes to saguaro, as you very likely know, we always talk about saguaro being bat pollinated. In our region, at least, it's also white-winged doves that come and pollinate because the flowers stay open during the day. In environments even hotter than ours, the flowers will have wilted by the morning and no daytime pollinator comes. But doves do a pretty decent job on these plants. Now, of course, there's more, just to mention them. There's plenty of other insects. There's beetles who are thought to be like the ancestral pollinators, sort of the very first pollinators. There's flies, for instance, that's a syrphid fly on ocotillo. Butterflies, wasps, that's a fig wasp that I'll mention later. And then, you know, crazy stuff. These are just, you know, a few I pulled out. Honey possums and lemurs and geckos, and it just makes you want to travel the world and study really strange pollination systems. Now, you know, that lemur, for instance, things that eat flowers sometimes are surprisingly good pollinators, well, because they're very messy when they do it. But geckos, I mean, really? Wow, that's cool. And then there's wind. I mean, I can't give short shrift to that because wind pollinated flowers are characteristic too. Teeny weeny little flowers, colorless. I mean, they don't have bright petals, right? Huge amounts of pollen and no nectar at all, right? So knowing that, you can actually go out and make a pretty good stab, even if you have no idea what the plant species is, make a pretty good guess as to who's the pollinator. So I want to tell you some stories. And this was, you know, the issue that I've been agonizing over is like, what stories am I going to tell? So I decided to just key it to three things about pollination I think is really interesting. One is, how do you reproduce sexually when you're stuck in place? It's a problem. The second is, pollination ain't free. You got to pay for it if you're a plant. And then the third is, there's this really interesting spectrum of specialization to generalization. And so I want to say some things about specialization. Okay, point number one, sex is hard when you're stuck in place. And I want to talk about desert mistletoe, a plant that you all very likely know. But first, let's step back a bit and just think about plant sex. Because what's cool about plants is they have so many different ways of dividing up the male function, production of pollen, and the female function, production of seeds. That can be on the same plant, it can be on different plants, all kinds of ways to do it. There's kind of three main reproductive systems, although there's some others I'm happy to mention at the end. And that's plants that are hermaphroditic, monoecious, and dioecious. And all you really need to do is look at the pictures here. Plants with hermaphroditic flowers, every flower has both anthers and stigmas. So it makes pollen, it makes ovules. That's 80% of all flowering plants. So the vast majority of plants, virtually most of what you know in the Sonoran Desert is hermaphroditic. All the cacti, creosote, mesquite, palo verde, all that stuff. They're all hermaphroditic. You look at a flower, there's anthers, there's stigmas. So what else is there? Well, there's monaceae. Monaceae is, there's some flowers that are male, and there's some flowers that are female, but they're on the same plant. Okay, and there's all kinds of evolutionary theory about why you would do one versus the other, what the costs and benefits are, blah, blah, blah. But here it's just a matter of like, what are our examples? The best local example I know is ambrosia, triangle leaf burr sage is monoecious. And then there's dioecious. So dioecious plants, that's us, right? I mean, we're not plants, but we're dioecious. There's male individuals and there's female individuals. Okay, and that's about 6% of all flowering plants. And it differs depending on what habitat you're in. And some plants we know very well are dioecious. So for instance, jojoba is dioecious. I mean, I have jojoba all over our property. I've never really stared at the flowers, but that's the females and that's the male. And this kind of thing that is important economically, because in this case, jojoba oil, which is of huge interest in the cosmetic and natural foods industry and so on, that only comes from the females because it's from the fruits that you press the oils. But if you're going to get fruits, you better make sure you have some male plants around, right? And then the other one is desert mistletoe. That's the other great example, which you may not realize is dioecious, in part because the flowers are crazy small. They're about the size of a pinhead, really. And the funny thing is that there's a huge number of pollen, and there's almost no nectar there. Huge number of pollinators visit these flowers, or insects visit these flowers for that tiny bit of nectar. They're flowering at a time when almost nothing else is. It's like December, January, I forget. But you have these giant insects hovering over these tiny little flowers, trying to get what they can out of them. And there are male plants and there's female plants. So a male plant has only male flowers and a female plant has only female flowers. That means for seeds to be produced on a female plant, you have to get your pollinators, your bee in this case, to first visit the males, get some nectar from the males, get some pollen on them, and then go off and find a female plant, which is a problem, right? I mean, male plants have to find female plants, but they're stuck in place, right? And that's a really interesting problem. And I had a grad student work on this several years ago, Kelsey Ewell, who now works up at ASU on plants. And she did amazing work on this right around Tucson. What she was interested in is the sex ratio in plants. So you can go to a plant and say, that's a male, that's a female, that's a male, that's a female. And so Kelsey had a hypothesis that your success as a female was a function not only of the number of mistletoes in a tree, but also what the sex ratio was in the trees. Because given their druthers, the bees just don't go very far. The pollinators don't go very far. So they go from plant to plant to plant. And so what she did is she covered with bags. So she first of all figured out the number of mistletoes in these trees and the sex ratio. And then, for instance, she put giant bags around half the males and then looked to see how the females did reproductively. And what she found is by removing male mistletoes from a host tree, led the female mistletoes to receive less pollen. So this is pollen receipt. And this is whether the mistletoe was growing on acacia or mesquite. And in both cases, getting rid of a bunch of the males led to much, much lower reproductive success in the females. Now, what determines the sex ratio in the tree? Well, of course, the older the host tree, the more time there is for the plants to build up. Now, the sex ratio is 50-50. So you're going to, just by chance, have some trees that are all females, and they'll be sitting there getting virtually no pollen. And then others will be all male. And then the mistletoes that do the best have the luck of being in a tree with a fairly even sex ratio. It's a really interesting challenge for these plants. But there's another wee problem here, actually, and this Kelsey worked on also, which is the seed dispersal. As you likely know, the fruits are dispersed by one bird and one bird only. It's our phainopepla. Now, in general, seed dispersal is very generalized, far more generalized than pollination is. Mistletoe breaks that rule. It's a spectacular breaking of that rule. Pollination is generalized. Seed dispersal is done by that bird. So the bird comes along, takes the fruit. Fruit's very sticky, of course, and then digests it, is sitting in the tree, eating the fruits, poops out the seeds. They get stuck on the butt, actually, of the phainopepla. And the bird does this little movement and wipes the seed onto the host plant, and that's how you get a mistletoe growing in a tree. You'll never see them on the ground. They've got to be in a tree. Well, the problem is that that the phainopepla only eats mistletoe fruit, but the other thing it eats is insects, because it feeds insects to its nestlings. And where's it going to get insects? It eats the pollinators. Okay, so you have a pollination mutualism whose worst enemy is the seed dispersal mutualism on the same plant. And there's really interesting dynamic consequences of that. And Kelsey studied that in the field and also did some spectacular mathematical modeling of all this to see the interaction between the interactions. And I'm happy to talk much more about that. Key point here, sex is really tricky when you're rooted in place. Particularly, these plants have no possibility of self-pollination, right? They can't use that as a backup because they're like us. They're either all male or they're all female. Okay, so that's story number one. Story number two involves Jimson weed, and it's about the cost of mutualism. I have been studying this interaction for lots of years. Every time I try to stop, somebody in my lab finds something new to study about it. Okay, and so we know a lot about it now, and everything we find out, it just opens up more questions. Everything we thought about the system turned out to be wrong, and so it just, it's the gift that keeps on giving. So here's the deal. This is Manduca sexta, commonly known as the tobacco hornworm. If you grow tomatoes around here and you get hornworms, it's these guys, pretty much. There's one other very similar species, which does more or less the exact same thing I'm talking about here. Tobacco hornworm found throughout North America. Okay, now this is a really important insect in insect biology because it's like the lab rat of insect biology, right? Like the lab rat of rats is the rat, right? And or the mouse, and the lab rat of plants is Arabidopsis. Well, the lab rat of insect biology is this guy, because it's really easy to, they have really big brain and big neurons, and you can like put electrodes in and figure out exactly what they're smelling and what they're sensing. And my husband, who's in the entomology department, they do things like cut them open and add organs and remove organs and glue them shut, and they just like go about their daily life, and then you can see what they do with twice the amount of body fat they have and things like that. And they're crazy. They're very, very useful. But until we started studying them around here, very little of their natural history was known, because everybody uses like lab colonies that you rear in the lab. So huge geographic range, but everywhere you find, so throughout North America, but everywhere you find it, it's a specialist. It only eats one or two plant species, which is really cool. And this is our plant, Datura wrightii. There's one other Datura discolor, which is around here. Datura wrightii, commonly called Jimson weed, is a native perennial in the Southwest through our whole area. Huge white flowers, really, really toxic leaves. The other species, Datura discolor, if you have a Datura that looks like that, but it has a bit of a purple splash in it, that's Datura discolor. It's an annual, but otherwise is extremely similar to this. Yeah, it's an infamous hallucinogen. Can you believe that there used to be a golden guide to hallucinogenic plants? I mean, it's long out of print, but just, is that not amazing? It really brings you back to the 70s, doesn't it? There's Datura. And this was a vision quest plant, for instance, for the yaqui. So culturally, really, really interesting species. But yeah, incredible toxins in that plant. So these are our protagonists. Well, we can think about this from the pollination perspective. Giant white flower, blooms at night, large tubular display, highly reflective at night, strong perfume-like odor. Flower only lasts one night. It's kind of amazing. I mean, the flowers are this big. Classic hawk moth pollination syndrome. Okay, I mean, totally, it hits all the check boxes for a plant pollinated by hawk moths. And you know, they're great at it. The moth comes in, puts this incredible tongue down into the flower, probes around, collects nectar, and in the process, they transfer a lot of pollen. And we've looked at this. We cannot, with our little probes and Q-tips, we can't do a better job pollinating a flower than that moth can in a couple of seconds. They're really good at it. And, you know, from the moth perspective, there's no doubt this plant is fabulous. It has a huge nectar reward. I mean, these numbers won't mean much to you, but that's a lot of nectar. And it's a very, very sugary nectar. So, you know, from the perspective of the plant, though, realize that that's an incredible nutrient and water investment to get pollination, right? So you're making this giant flower. You have to keep it turgid. You have all this water in the nectar. Flowers only open one night. You're in the Sonoran Desert. I mean, it's crazy. And then there's, you know, there's amino acids in the nectar. So that is a big cost of pollination. There's one other reason why, so, you know, to get this moth, you're paying a serious cost to do that. But there's another cost, and that's what makes this system so interesting, which is that after feeding on nectar, the female moths flip their abdomen around and lay their eggs there. In fact, it's one of only 2 plant species in the Sonoran Desert that they will lay their eggs on. The other's devil's claw for odd reasons. So what you have is pollination by the adults and then consumption, herbivory, by the caterpillars. And when they start eating, they really eat, right? They eat the flowers. They try to eat the fruits. They can completely defoliate a plant, right? And there's just no leaves left. So in order to get pollination from that moth, the plants are not only investing a huge amount in all the stuff that makes the flower and makes the flower attractive, they then pay with all their leaves. And it's not a cost that can be escaped, because it turns out that behaviorally, and now it's known from other labs, neurologically, nectar feeding and egg laying are very tightly coupled. I mean, it's a brain thing. When a female nectars, she desperately wants to lay an egg, and she'll immediately flip her abdomen around to do it. She doesn't fly off to another plant to do it. So the plant that gets pollinated is the plant that gets the eggs. The plant is stuck with that. So how can such a specialized pollination mutualism evolve and persist when such a high cost has to be paid for the partner's services? I've been working on this for 15 years. And I'm not going to tell you the answer. I'm happy at the end to, like, if you're interested, to tell you what we know so far. But let me just say, biologists love to seek out stories that make no sense whatsoever. And this is our bread and butter, right? We want to find situations like this, because if we can understand why the plant, and this is a really specialized system. No other moth can really do what this moth does for this plant. If we could understand how this whole system evolves, given that cost, we'd know a lot about pollination in general. We'd understand why it's so darn costly, but yet beneficial. Okay, so yeah, key point. There's a conflict of interest between the plants and the pollinators here. You know, it's in the moth's benefit to visit the flowers because they get nectar. It's in the moth's benefit for that moth to visit the flower because it disperses pollen. It's in the moth's benefit to lay eggs and eat that plant. It is not in the plant's benefit. So there's conflicts of interest. And that's sort of the key point. Pollination is never accomplished by animals so that the plant does well. Animals are not being generous to plants. They're not pollinating in order to further the plant population. You got to consider their perspective. They're in it for themselves, but some, although not all of their activities, also happen to benefit their partner. So if you like, they're reciprocally parasitizing each other. And in many ways, it works out for the benefit of both of them. Okay, third story, specialization and coevolution, particularly specialization. This is really important. If you look at pollination, plant pollinator interactions anywhere, including in the Sonoran Desert, they form this fabulous continuum from being super specialized to being super generalized. So the Datura Manduka interaction I was just talking about is pretty specialized. The plants can get pollinated one or two other insects. The moth, occasionally it visits another flower. It's pretty close. I'm going to tell you the story of yucca, which sort of is the far extreme when it comes to specialization. Now, over here on the generalized line, we have a huge number of the pollination systems we know. One that I've worked a lot on that I won't be telling you about is manzanita on Mount Lemmon. When we started studying these in the 90s, there were 40 or 50 different pollinator species at Gordon Hirabayashi, where we were studying. And they were all pretty decent pollinators of manzanita. Unfortunately, now you go and look at manzanita and about 90% of the visitors are honeybees. In the 90s, honeybees were just starting to get into that part of Mount Lemmon. Now it's 90% honeybees. And we don't know if diversity is low because the honeybees have aggressively replaced the other pollinators, but it's a very different pollinator community than it was. Still quite generalized. Now, everything else is kind of in between the two extremes, and that includes all our cacti, because the thing that loves cacti more than anything is this group of bees called the cactus bees. They like a lot of different kinds of cacti. There's a few other things, actually plant families that are closely related to the Cactaceae. The cactus bees will visit, but they really like their cacti. Now, on the other hand, for instance, with barrel cactus, which I've studied a lot, honeybees will not go in a barrel cactus. There's something really repellent about it to them. So you get this really interesting continuum of specialization, right? Now that's, this is a classic insect pollinated flower, a bee pollinated flower. So when I say it's generalized, what I mean is there's a lot of different bees and a few flies and a butterfly or two. But in terms of species, it's a lot. Okay, so, and this sort of relates to a big question in ecology, which is why be a specialist and why be a generalist? And just to point out this idea that you go from generalization to specialization. You can ask the same thing, for instance, in predation, so predator-prey interaction. You have something like orcas, which are a super generalized predator, and then you have anteaters, which are super specialized, and then you have us, and some people are generalist eaters, and some. I don't think you could subsist on vegan Caribbean soul food, although I'd rather do that than go to Denny's, let me just say. But so it's a general question. You'd think like it would. The advantage of being a generalist is there's always some food around, right? It's, most of it's probably crap, but at least there's some food. The benefit of being a specialist is you have a food that you're perfectly adapted to. There's just not very much of it, right? So what's really fascinating about nature is both those strategies coexist, right? Each of them has costs and benefits so that you can have both. But let's talk about yuccas, because yuccas are wild. Okay, we have 3 yucca species here in the Southwest, right around Tucson. This is the one that I call the median strip yucca. This is the one that's all up and down Oracle and off to the side. And don't run out in the middle of Oracle to study it, but there's places you can pull your car aside and look at this one. This is Yucca shottii, which is on Mount Lemmon and Madeira Canyon. And Bear Canyon, and places like that, much stouter, heavy leaves. And then Yucca baccata, you see in the lowlands, often growing intermixed with Yucca elata. So those are the 3 other yuccas you might know. Is Joshua tree, is a yucca. Hespero yucca whippleii, Whipple's yucca, which is around the LA area. Those are all yuccas, okay? There's about 40 yucca species. They just barely get into Canada, and they go down into Central America. And every single yucca species has a different yucca moth pollinator, okay? And there's a very little bit of leakage between them, but not very much, okay? So 40 yucca species, 40 yucca moth species. Now that looks like a big gorgeous moth that's about ½ inch long, okay? And this is basically the way the story goes. A yucca moth lands on a flower. She's carrying a ball of sticky pollen that she's picked up on another flower. She takes part of that pollen and actively jams it down the stigma. Okay, it's a stigma with a very deep cleft in it. She takes some of the sticky pollen and actively jams it down. Now, the vast majority, 99% of pollinator behavior in animals is just this passive thing, right? They're feeding on flowers and then some pollen gets rubbed off. This is what's called active pollination. She is going to a lot of trouble to do this. Why does she do it? Because then she flips her abdomen around and she lays eggs in there. And what happens next is her eggs hatch and the caterpillars start feeding. And they feed on the developing seeds. So when you open a yucca, afterwards, when the fruits mature, this one is a Joshua tree, you have a bunch of seeds that have been eaten out by the caterpillars. If you take Yucca elata, our common one, and you open them up, they have these black papery seeds. But if you can see that one, it looks like this ring. That's a seed that has been just burrowed straight through by a yucca moth. You'll have a little set of 40 or 50 seeds that look like this, with a hole, just like a bullet hole drilled straight through that thing. And those have been eaten by the yucca moths. So what's going on? The yuccas make no nectar. The reason yucca moths go to those flowers is to provide food for their offspring. So what the yucca moth is getting out of this interaction isn't nectar, it's seeds. If her offspring are going to eat seeds, then she's got to make sure that there's going to be seeds. So she actively pollinates. Now, weirdly, what this means is that yuccas are sacrificing babies to make babies, as I put it. They are sacrificing seeds to the offspring of their own pollinators, because it's the only way that they can get pollinated. So they start, for instance, making 100 seeds, and they end up with 50 seeds because 50 of them got eaten by the offspring of their only possible pollinator. So we're back to, wow, that's a costly mutualism. Okay, so after finishing their little meal, the caterpillars chew their way out of the fruit. If you've ever looked at pods like this, you'll find little bullet holes through them. That's the yucca moths chewing out. They drop to the soil and they overwinter in the soil. And they can stay in the soil for a really long time. We think years and years and years. Tried to do an experiment at the Desert Museum on this. Might still be out there. The yucca moths down on the ground there. But eventually in the spring, the yucca moths come up. We infer this. No one's ever seen it. They mate, and the whole thing starts again. They repeat the whole cycle. Okay. Now, if you look at the specificity of this, it's like, what maintains this incredible specificity? There's matching adaptations between the yuccas and the yucca moths. The yuccas have super sticky pollen and they have no nectar. Turns out the yucca moths have lost their entire digestive system. They have turned their mouth parts into these big tentacles that holds the ball of pollen. And so like if a yucca moth had a chin, they'd be holding the pollen under the chin, right? So they can't feed, they have modified mouth parts. They find the plants by a specific odor that each plant species puts out, and it's the only place that they can lay eggs. So one yucca moth. And then if you were to compare yuccas and yucca moths to their closest relatives, you can see how incredibly modified there are. So you would compare yuccas to agaves. And, in a lot of ways, the fruits, the flowers look kind of the same. The fruits look really the same, but fundamentally different. So, for instance, agaves have huge amounts of nectar. And they're pollinated, depending on the species, either by bats or bees or hawk moths. Yucca moths' closest relatives, of course, have not lost their mouth parts. They're much more ordinary garden variety moths. And we know from evolutionary studies, yucca moths didn't start as generalists and then evolve into being specialists. They started as specialized seed consumers that never even visited the flowers. They just went to the fruits, laid their eggs there. And then over evolutionary time, they added in the whole pollination routine, right? Because if your babies are going to eat seeds, there's very strong selection pressure to make sure that there are seeds. And so they gained all the behaviors to pollinate, which is pretty cool. So the key point here, pollination varies in specificity and also in evolutionary trajectories. And so, the three systems I've talked about today are ultra specialized, pretty specialized, and really generalized. And then you could say things that go along with that about their evolutionary trajectories. Now, two other systems I've worked on kind of squeeze in there, and I just wanted to mention them. I've worked a lot on barrel cactus and cactus bees. They would fit in there. More generalized, certainly, than the Jimson weed system, a lot less generalized than this. And then there's figs and fig wasps. Figs and fig wasps are even more specialized than yuccas and yucca moths. I wasn't going to say anything about figs. And then I realized I have to say something about figs. What I should be telling you is we are not in the geographic range of figs here. You plant a fig, you're not going to get the pollination mutualism going. You shouldn't. The nearest Ficus petiolaris to this campus is 140 miles away, except for the Ficus petiolaris tree that's planted next to the main library on campus. which I've been looking off and on and now fairly seriously. Ficus petiolaris has somehow gotten its pollinator. That pollinator should be 200 miles away from here. But these are amazing photos of Bruce Tobert, if anybody knows Bruce. That is a fig wasp, and it's the obligate pollinator of this fig, which is native to Baja. These are cheater wasps, which are non-pollinators, but obligately associated with the fig. These wasps have somehow made it to Tucson and somehow are managing to persist here. I have asked everybody if they know of any full-size Ficus petiolaris tree anywhere in Tucson other than this one on campus, and nobody has yet given me an answer. If you know this species and can give me any hint where there's other trees in this town, I would love to know, because I can show you the theory that will tell you why these wasps cannot persist if there's a single tree. The wasps have not read my theory papers, which is kind of tragic, but either we've discovered something fundamentally different about figs and fig wasps, or there's more trees out there, and I figure you're the right people to ask. Okay, my final point is the future of pollination, right? Pollination matters. Right? I mean, pollination matters. And in part, that's a scientific issue and a social issue, and in part it isn't. It's a philosophical, it's an ethical issue. I believe that nature matters independently of us. I would imagine I'm preaching to the choir there. But that is not, the idea that nature matters is not something that we can necessarily build policy and actions around. It's our personal motivation about it. What works better is to point out, as usual, that it's all about us. We need pollination because we like our lives, and we want our lives to persist with the foods we like. So this is a classic graphic here. You know, 2 out of every 3 bites we take, and that's actually a good calculation, is attributable to pollination, right? Because either we eat fruits or we eat animals that eat fruits and so on, or we eat flowers. So if we don't, for instance, have bees, we lose a vast amount of the food that we depend on. And it's a good economic argument for why we need to think about preservation of pollination. Now, as I say, it would take another whole lecture to talk about what the threats to pollination are, what they are, how important they are, what's going on here in particular, how concerned we should be, whether the problem is actually overblown. There's a great deal to be said about this, but this is not the talk to do that. But I do want to end instead with, like, what are we going to do about this, right? It's like, is there anything, I mean, what can we as individuals do to make a difference in the way of pollination? And I think, you know, as I think about it, I think about sort of 3 categories of things we can do. One is conservation, which is sort of keeping what we have. And a lot of that is how to make our gardens happy places for pollinators and so on. And I imagine this is something that you guys think about a lot. There's a lot of decisions to be made about how to make a garden that will work to be both friendly to natives in particular, and that will attract pollinators, and that will attract pollinators that will actually come, right? Putting up one plant that's bat pollinated is probably not going to help the bats very much, for instance, but putting up a small patch of bee pollinated plants might make more of a difference. The second is restoration, which is getting back what we've lost. And a lot of that is taking, for instance, abandoned pieces of land around Tucson and starting to build habitats that can bring pollinators back. It's also about, for instance, extending the range of species into parts of the Southwest where they used to be and have been lost, right? So getting old ranges back. And then reconstruction, which is sort of making something new. Honeybees are not the bee species we have to worry about. Let me just say that. I don't think we're helping bees very much by introducing more honeybees, which are not natives, into the area. But it does raise the possibility of really trying to do something new about conservation. So, you know, what I've seen in the last few years is people, including a lot of people in Tucson, they really, really care about pollination, right? People go out to and watch the bats under the bridges, and a lot of those bats are insectivorous, but some are pollinators. We have all kinds of great pollinator gardens at Reed Park, and then of course at the Desert Museum, which has put such effort into pollinator conservation, and then all kinds of efforts to spread ideas about how to build pollinator-friendly gardens. There's the promise of citizen science. I mean, more and more, we're all going out and contributing scientific data. So for instance, a lot of work on saguaros that goes on out of Saguaro National Park is being done by volunteers going out, for instance, with that big blowdown of saguaros last month, is going out and collecting the data. Going out and collecting phenological data. The National Phenology Network, which is, you know, the clearinghouse for information on phenology of all plants in North America, is based right here in Tucson, a couple blocks away from here, participating through iNaturalist. So we have this opportunity to get involved and do very direct action. One thing we've discovered at the University of Arizona, and absolutely in my lab, these are all my graduate students, is God, kids love pollination. They love pollinators. We were at the Arizona Insect Festival, which many of you might have attended last month, and I was standing in front of the white-lined sphinx moth thing and talking over and over and over again about hawk moth pollination. And you know, these little kids were coming up to me and saying, "Is that a Hyles lineata?" And it was just the cutest thing. They know so much and they really, really care. And a thing I absolutely love about my graduate students is they love going out to schools. There's these STEM events, STEAM events, and so on. They go out, they bring all the kits, and they teach the kids about pollination. And I think that's the future, and thank God, it's really exciting. And you know, you guys care too, and that's why you're here and in the society. And I really appreciate the invitation to talk, and ask me anything you want.
Thank you. I will, we'll obviously take questions from the audience and from our online folks as well. But I do want to mention that we had some folks answer the fig thing. Let's see here.
Oh, good.
Let's see. There are ficus at the Mission Gardens. Those would be Ficus carica.
That would be Ficus carica.
Yep.
Yes.
So one person recommended Pima County Extension. Another person mentioned fig trees next to the Physics and Gould Simpson buildings. Those may also be.
Yeah, different species.
And then sadly, I can say at the Desert Museum, we have both Ficus petiolaris and palmeri, yes, and also Ficus pertusa that do produce fruits.
They do produce fruits.
And there's one very, very large Ficus petiolaris right by the restaurant.
Okay. We will talk. I remember them as like being in pots and being quite small.
They got
big. Oh, cool. Well, we will get that information from you. This is, yeah, I mean, this is why I wanted to talk to you guys. This is all the work we're doing in the lab right now is very, very new. And I actually want to flip back to that slide because I just want to show you one cool thing there. So we have a lot of these non-pollinator wasps. They use the inside of the fig, but they are not dependent on the pollinator except for one thing. The only way, so you know, this is an enclosed ball of flowers, and everybody's developing inside this enclosed ball of flowers. There's only one way out, and that is if the males of that species, which I'm not showing, chew a tiny little hole out. What that means is if that species is absent, everybody dies trapped inside. You cut open one of these figs that falls to the ground off this tree, and you have this writhing mass of like 150 wasps, and each of these is about 1 millimeter long. right? I mean, these are tiny wasps, and they're trapped and they can't get out. Well, what we've discovered last month is if you go to this tree at the library and you pick up some figs from the ground, they have these big holes in them. And we were really curious about that. And from my grad student and an undergrad watching this tree, it seems like sparrows are coming through and going to the figs, which is a great source of insect protein, and poking holes in and eating some of them. And while they do that, while the birds do that, it's an escape hatch for those wasps. And the wasps are sneaking out. And we think that's how they're, why this isn't a death trap, is that those birds, in the course of eating the wasps are also escaping instead of dying trapped in there. Isn't that weird? Crazy system.
We have any questions in the room here?
Yeah. In that bottom middle picture, what are those lines coming off the?
Those are the ovipositors, the stingers.
Those are long.
They are incredible. That's a genus called Idarnes, and every single New World fig, which is a few hundred, has at least one species of this associated with it. So what the pollinator does is the pollinator gets inside the fig and then deposits pollen on the flowers, which are all inside, and then lays her eggs. What Idarnes does with this crazy ovipositor is drills it, never gets inside, drills it in, feels around, and lays her eggs. But isn't that nuts? Yeah, they're really incredible.
So we have a question from our online audience. This is from Emily Rocky. Great talk. Can you please summarize your perspective on the current and future status of native pollinators versus honeybees in terms of resources and opportunities? Noticed your honeybees on slides today, but also heard you talk about the Arctostaphylos on Mount Lemmon.
Yeah. Honeybees are introduced, right? They came into North America in the 1600s. I've heard various stories about this. They got to the Southwest relatively early. There's at least some stories that Father Kino brought them because he wanted beeswax for candles in the church. I don't know where I heard that. I haven't been able to track it down. Honeybees are in trouble in North America in agriculture, and the reason is because of the way we manage honeybees. We truck them around the country. It puts them under a lot of stress. Meanwhile, they're picking up pesticides and herbicides that are being used on plants. They are being dealt blows from multiple directions. And because of that, honeybee health has plunged in the US, and that has really big effects on agriculture for like the almond crop in California. But that's an agricultural problem. Honeybees are native to North Africa, right? It was introduced. They are used for agriculture. They don't happen to be particularly great pollinators. We don't use honeybees in agriculture because they're the best pollinator. We use honeybees in agriculture because they're very easy to manage, because you can take the hives, which is a lot of bees, in a box, and you can move them around. So if you're talking about pollination of anything native in the Southwest, you are not talking about honeybees. So you're talking about native bees, this well over 1,000 species. Okay, so you have these very large genera like Diadasia, which are cactus bees. You have centrus bees, which really love creosote and have really interesting biology. You have osmia, you have the leaf cutter bees, which a graduate student of mine works on, who are really cool. If you have like rose plants and they have these perfect circles cut out of them, that's leaf cutter bees. And what they're doing is they're taking the leaves and making a nest out of them, making like a cigar tube of leaves. And then they're also really important pollinators. So all of those bees are the bees that our natives depend on. What kind of shape are they in terms of what their population sizes are like, their health? We know surprisingly little. it seems clear they're not doing well at all, but it's very hard to get the data. So for instance, a lot of, is it Diadasia, I think, nests in the ground in vacant lots around Tucson. So if you have a property and you notice a lot of holes in it, and then in the spring you notice bees coming out, they tend to aggregate, and they all nest in the same place. And so it's really important to save those places. Also to put up bee boxes and things like that, so that they have nesting substrates. We think that a lot of the reason we're losing those bees is they don't have places to nest. They're losing habitat, and far and away the most important thing for everything that's happening to pollinators. And of course, there's, you know, as I say, there's many risks. You know, this death by 1,000 cuts things, probably as in endangerment of all species on the planet, actually the #1 cause is habitat loss. It's turning native lands into croplands, it's turning them into cities, it's clearing them for roads and so on. And that's the problem. And so I think we could safely say that the native bees are not doing very well, but we don't have anywhere near the kind of data we have on honeybees. Because with honeybees, it's an economic issue, and that's why so much effort has gone into it.
If I may, you had mentioned that the yucca moth started off as a specialist seed eater, but not a pollinator. Given that those yuccas are only pollinated by those yucca moths, what pollinated them before the yucca moths?
I think it's generally assumed that they had nectar, that they had a more normal stigma, and that they were likely generalist pollinated by insects. I know a little more about where they think the yucca moth came from than the yucca. But since their closest relatives are things like aloes and agaves and things like that, Dasylirion, Sotal, I think we can look at those flowers and make some kind of guess as to what visited them. So the general idea, and this is backed by good studies of reconstruction of evolutionary relationships, is that initially there was some other kind of generalist pollinator. These moths laid their eggs directly into the flowers or the developing fruit, and then fed on the seeds. They do basically exactly what they do now. So and they were complete specialists at that time. So you don't have to explain in a way why they're specialists. They've always been specialists. I mean, going way back. What you have to explain is why they're specialist seed predators that also pollinate. That's what makes them unusual, which is really neat. Now, there are still other close yucca moth relatives associated with yuccas that don't pollinate. They only do the seed predator thing. So for each of our yuccas has 2 or 3 yucca moth relatives that are only seed predators, that are kind of freeloading on the whole thing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have another online question. Plants can compete for pollinators. Can they also help one another by helping to support populations of the same generalist pollinator? I think maybe they're asking about plants being UGF or pollen. Yeah,
so this is actually a really interesting area of research. So if 2 plants are flowering at the same time, 2 plant species flowering at the same time, they're competing for pollinators. And you get a lot of interesting dynamics because of that, because the pollinators, if it's a generalist, the pollinators are making choices. And so they're likely to go to the one that has more nectar, or that's more conspicuous, or that there's more flowers. But there's a fair number of cases that have been studied, and I do a lot of my work in the Rocky Mountains. And if anyone knows Crested Butte, Rocky Mountain Biological Station, it's like the premier place in the world to study pollination. It's a lot of data we know from that area, where it turns out that, so let me say, in alpine Colorado, it's a very, very compressed flowering period. You only get like 2 months to flower, because it snows, you flower, and then it snows again. So everybody's trying to flower at exactly the same time. And it turns out that there are groups of species that if they flower at the same time, they are a bigger signal for pollinators to come. So the plants end up competing, but still, if they flower at the same time as another species, more pollinators come in per capita. So they still have to share them, but they end up what's called facilitating each other. The other way they can facilitate each other is if they flower in very, very close sequence. So the pollinators are on one plant species, and just as that one is decreasing in abundance, another one comes into flower in the same area, and so the pollinators stick around. So you get this kind of sequential facilitation. So there's a fairly limited circumstance under which that works, in which the benefit of flowering at the same time outweighs the cost of flowering at the same time, but it definitely exists and has been well documented.
And you also have time of day, right?
Yes.
Plants in the same place, early in the morning and in the afternoon.
In most places around here, it seems like everything's only in the morning because it's so hard to flower late in the day here. I mean, so many of our flowers have, you kind of packed it in by about 11 in the morning, right? Which, as a pollination biologist, I kind of appreciate because I want to pack it in at 11 in the morning, right? Except for my, my datura system where it only gets going at dusk. I don't know if you've ever watched a datura. They're shut, in a very tight spiral. And right at dusk, I mean, you can watch this. It takes like 2 minutes. They go and they open up. And it's a beautiful thing to watch. And what's really fun is you'll often get this cloud of honeybees and some native bees, but mostly honeybees, that they can't get into that tight spiral. They really want to get in. And so they're hovering in this cloud. The flower opens, honeybees dive inside. Now the honeybees will not take the nectar because all those nasty toxins, these incredible alkaloids, will kill the bees. But the honey, the nectar's down at the base of the flower. They go to the pollen, which doesn't have the toxins, and they strip the pollen and they're out of there. And then it gets to be dusk and they're done for the day. So by the time the hawk moths show up, a lot of the pollen's actually gone from the honeybees. And then if the flowers stay open just a little bit at dawn, which they will if it's a cooler morning, the honeybees will come back. Turns out honeybees, in the course of all this, I mean, they're removing a huge amount of pollen from the system, but there might actually be a benefit to it. We have some work that shows that it's a good backup mechanism if there's no hawk moths around. Yeah.
And sorry, I know we're getting kind of later in the evening here, but really quickly, you mentioned you studied the diadasia bees and barrel cacti. Barrel cacti, like a lot of other plants, have extrafloral nectaries.
That was the main thing we were studying.
That attract ants.
Yeah.
Now, is the function of that the extrafloral nectaries attract the ants and the ants prevent florivory or nectar stealing?
Okay,
pollen stealing?
Yeah, let me get back to a good barrel cactus photo here. Yes, barrel cactus. Okay, so barrel cactus has extrafloral nectaries, and I worked on this for many years at Tumamoc Hill, and this was the story I couldn't fit in. So the ants come to these nectaries, so they're outside flowers, and the ants attack herbivores on the plants, and at least have the potential to benefit the plant because the herbivores often eat the flowers or they eat the fruit. Okay, so and we documented that in a lot of depth. Now the question is, this is another one of these cases, so you have two mutualisms. You have ants defending the plants, that's a protection mutualism, and then you have the bees pollinating the plants. And the question is, how do the two interactions interact? Well, what we found is that the ant that is the most ferocious against herbivores, it's a native fire ant, Solenopsis islandii, loves to go in the flowers. And it loves to attack the bees. So what the ants are doing is they're snipping the anthers, which they consider food, and they're taking them down to the nest. And so if a pollinator stops by, the ant will grab the pollinator. And in fact, we have at least one case where you were netting the pollinators to identify them, and we pinned the pollinator and we discovered it had a Solenopsis head clamped on its leg. Right. So what we found is because of that, barrel cacti that were defended by that super aggressive ant actually made fewer fruit. And the reason is the bees would be about to land and they'd see that ant and it's like, no way. And they would leave, or they would make a very short visit. Meanwhile, the other ants aren't nearly as good protectors against herbivores, but they're really repelled from the flowers. They won't go anywhere near the flowers. And so they don't disrupt pollination. You know, so I think the ants protect the flowers in the sense that they do get, the flowers get less eaten if there's ants defending those plants. But on the other hand, if you have the best defender, you have a problem because they attack the pollinators. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, really.
My pleasure.
For speaking for us this
Yeah.
evening.
Thank you.